Welcome to episode 90 of Anchored in Education. I'm E. Scott England, and Anchored in Education is the podcast dedicated to all things education. Educators across the world routinely engage in conversations surrounding fundamentals, concepts, and new ideas that improve this great profession. Sometimes we agree, other times we disagree. But at the end of the day, we are all anchored in education. Yeah. So I just sent a message. We're cutting out.
Oh, okay. Do you want to try maybe the Zoom, perhaps?
Yeah. So let me. It is crazy. I've never had this happen with Google Meet. That's my guest today, Zak Cohen. In case you're still struggling to identify Zak, he is the one who sounds calm and collected, not exasperated, irritated, and embarrassed. That person is me. This episode is on normalizing professional failure. It is episode 90 of Anchored in Education, and it was the first time I had ever experienced what I determined in the moment to be a catastrophic failure. I was in a near panic. Thankfully, we took a moment to disconnect, then reconnect, and try again. Here's the result of take 2 of that first attempt to capture the conversation. But I do not want to quite continue because there's just still some issues going on. And okay. So I'm absolutely dumbfounded at this point as to how I have two modes to connect with people, and they don't.
Neither one seems to be cooperating at the moment.
Yeah, one won't give me. Second take, second failure. There is nothing like authentic learning on the topic of the day than to experience failure when the guest who is coming on is talking about how we need to normalize the experience. Of course, that's never how we think of it in the moment. I'm taken back to when I was teaching a math lesson in first grade while my principal was observing. It was an utter train wreck. Certain I was about to receive the lowest marks possible, my principal instead asked, what was my take? When I told her it was a disaster, she said, "Good, I'm glad you saw the same thing I did." But then her next statement completely reframed everything. Rather than chastising me, she said, "So how do you plan on fixing it?" That showed me that failing at something is far from the be-all, end-all. While we had 2 failed attempts, Zak and I gave validity to the expression, "The third time's a charm." Zak, welcome back to Anchored in Education.
Thank you, Scott.
Yeah, we can have this chuckle, though you're a first-time guest. When I say welcome back, this is our second attempt, as we kind of found through the intro yesterday, and we've really been talking. How interesting is it that on a topic in which we talk about, normalizing failure, that yesterday, in my opinion, was a catastrophic failure. Now, you may have a different opinion.
Yeah, I don't know if I would necessarily look at it as a failure at all, so much as perhaps just an opportunity. But it's funny. Yesterday, you had mentioned that there was an irony to it.
Yeah.
But I think I might say it's a little bit more of a serendipity because it forced us to actually, practice and kind of live what it is that we're going to talk about today. So I think what I would wonder, Scott, is just for the listeners, what would your experience with the 2 of us as we kind of tried to wrestle with and kind of work through some of the failings of yesterday?
Yeah, well, definitely giving you my perspective. So as a host of a podcast that's taking the time from guests, one of the things I want to value the time. And so when I start experiencing these failures, I have near a manic moment in which, everything that's supposed to just work when you go, snap your fingers, and all of a sudden everything's failing. Like, I could feel the sweats. I could feel my face getting red. I wanted to throw things and hit things, but then I also know that I'm on video and you can see me, and it's just not professional. Not to mention I can't afford any of the equipment in this studio, But then everything, it's like, Normally as things go wrong, you should be on autopilot and know how to address these as far as troubleshooting things that you work with every day. And I was not going through that, the normal troubleshooting, and like it wasn't working. So to me, it was either it works or it doesn't. There was no in between in diagnosing.
And I wonder, just in general, do you feel like just kind of in our exchange, and our interaction that we were able to kind of quell some of those frustrations and some of those concerns? And if so, what were some of the maybe things that we did to kind of help you through that?
Well, we definitely, you're very generous saying we and what we did to help quell, because you and I both know that without you on the other end, it could have turned out differently. And I say that to help listeners understand that, when we first started and we didn't even get anything recorded, Zoom wasn't working. I couldn't hear you. I couldn't see you. Saying we could chat back and forth. And I mean, so you didn't know at that time that my panic of everything failing was already setting in. But you're just like, hey, we've got Google Meet. I can send you a link. And then I'm like, oh, wait a second, that's how I used to start these. I can send Google Link. Let me send Google Link. Or Google Meet. And so I did that. And then like through every time, then when the audio started failing, you were just like, look, it's not a big deal. I'm going to run downstairs. Maybe it's something on my end. And so, we reconnected. You're in a different spot. And I mean, I'm going to be honest, Zach, I was thinking, let's hope that it's his upstairs and downstairs. But when it didn't, then I kind of cycled back around like, okay, it's back on me. It's back on me. And again, through just, so then, and you pointed out like we could have kept it serious and just, really dwelled on the failure, but we laughed. There was a lot of laughter in what we were doing. And it's one of those things where after so long, after so many attempts, I mean, we did 2 Zooms, we did 2 Google Meets before finally I'm like, we got to throw in the towel. It's not going to happen today. I've got to bring in an audio engineer. And it really, I mean, by the end, when we disconnected for the day, I think my blood pressure was back down. We were laughing. We were having a good time.
Yeah. So it sounds like, just right, trying to kind of distill some of that down. It sounds like, lead in with, kind of in the face of frustration, right, which is such a human, right, and natural response to those feelings of failure, right? And we're going to address that a little bit later. But it sounds like being able to lead with patience, and humor and perspective are 3 things that I was able to kind of, exhibit yesterday.
Yeah.
And it sounds like perhaps we're going to get into that a little bit today, right? I think that we always have to be kind of victim to our own research. So kind of with that, I think maybe as a bit of sort of a baseline and a bedrock for today's conversation, why don't we go ahead and dive in?
Yeah, well, I love that. And before we do you want to give listeners a little bit more about you and how you became anchored in education?
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm Zak Cohen. I'm the middle school director at Francis Parker School of Louisville. And yeah, just in terms of how I got anchored to education, I think to some extent I've been, genetically predisposed to teaching. Nearly all of my family members have been involved in education, some capacity or another, including my dad, who was an elementary school PE teacher in Brooklyn for 40 years.
Wow.
So I think just by virtue of my exposure to it, I, always saw education as a viable profession, or I don't know, maybe even better said, just a sort of inevitability in my life. But looking back on it, there are kind of these 3 moments that I think really kind of anchored me to education. The first of which is when I realized that of the many possible pathways available to me, education was really kind of the one that I wanted to pursue. And I think this realization was really crystallized when I was standing outside of an Italian restaurant in the North End after a college visit in Boston with my parents and my dad. And I don't remember exactly what this was apropos of, but I can remember it so vividly, him turning to me and looking at me and saying, Zach, you can be anything in this world except for an educator. And like any, dote and diligent and rebellious, adolescent, I took that to heart. And in many ways, I think that sort of solidified in me the sense that this could really be something that I might want to do. But naturally, not all pursuits turn into passion. So my second moment, I think, was, jump forward a few years, is when I realized that education was truly a passion of mine.
Okay.
And I think I realized that when I first set foot in a classroom in China. After I graduated from college, I went to volunteer in China for a couple of years. So I was teaching English in rural China. And I can remember my very first day walking into this classroom of 110 students and, standing up on the kind of this elevated, platform. And there was just this eruption of applause. And that moment was really powerful and really sort of resonant for me. And then kind of what unfolded from there over the course of the next 2 years was my sort of exposure to the complexity of these sort of adaptive and very sort of fluid human-centric challenges that really pushed me towards constant reflection and evaluation and this kind of appreciation that education is one of these fields where we can always get better. And I think for me, that's something that I've always found to be very appealing and sustaining. But in life, Scott, right, we have tons of passions. But passions, come and go. I no longer collect baseball cards, and I no longer, play Magic the Gathering. So I think my third moment is when I realized, I guess it's not a moment per se. It's kind of just slowly revealed itself over the course of the last decade, which is this appreciation that education is what, the Japanese refer to as an ikigai.
Okay.
And ikigai is a Japanese concept that means your reason for being. It's this point of confluence where what you love, what you're good at, what you can be paid for, and what the world needs all intersect. And this isn't something that we realize, in some eureka moment. It's something that we slowly begin to appreciate when day after day, you realize that you have more energy at the end of the school day than at the start of it. And so I think that kind of, these have been kind of the three, moments that have really kind of anchored me to education.
Oh, sure. And so do you feel that at the end of the school day, you have more energy than when you began?
Yes. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Nearly every day in order to get ready for this school day, I need a venti coffee from Starbucks. But at the end of the school day, I need the exact opposite.
Something to decent. That's good.
The middle schoolers fill my glass.
Oh, that is awesome. And I'm still trying to wrap my head around 110 students that you had talked about. But I also want to go back to just a quick follow up. Your father, after a college visit, said anything but education. Here you are. Do you feel that he was serious on that, or do you think secretly he's like following my footsteps?
I think to some extent it was tongue in cheek. And one of the things I can definitely tell you is every day on my drive to work, I have two things. One I've already spoken to, which is a venti drink from Starbucks, but the other of which is a cell phone and a call with my dad.
Oh.
So I talk to him every morning on my way to school. And oftentimes it's just kind of bouncing problems with practice off him. He's retired now, but I just greatly value kind of his opinion and perspective and vantage point. And it's always helpful to just have him weigh in on some of the things that I might be struggling with on a particular day.
Yeah.
So I think in that moment, I think he appreciated the frustration of the profession and the challenges of the profession, and maybe he did want something else for me. But certainly now that I'm in it, he's immensely proud and an incredible partner.
I love that. All right. So today's conversation, if people haven't figured out by now, it generally is not center stage on Anchored in Education, but you thoughtfully point out that failure is education's most untapped and underutilized learning device. So before we can really dive into why this is, start off with why normalizing professional failure is so important.
Yeah, that's a great question, Scott. It's kind of like a funny idea though, right? That mistake learning isn't a topic that often takes center stage because it's such a universal experience, right? Like failure is such a universal experience, but of course you're correct, right? In spite of its universality, mistake learning is one of the most untapped and underutilized learning resources at our disposal. And largely This is because we don't yet know how people actually learn from their mistakes. And because we don't know how people learn from their mistakes, we very often find ourselves to be fearful of them, right? Just kind of that like, very innate fear of the unknown.
Yeah.
And this fear is actually prevalent enough to warrant its own diagnosis in the medical nomenclature. It's called aticophobia, which is a fear of failure or fear of mistakes.
Yeah.
Yeah. The thing is, though, right, we all acknowledge that some of our greatest learning has been the result of our mistakes, right? There are times when we're able to reflect on what went wrong, pocket those lessons, and, move forward with a greater confidence. But on the other hand, there have been times when we make a mistake, we grow frustrated, and we take nothing away from the experience. And what actually accounts for this difference? And why is it that sometimes we learn and sometimes we stagnate or even regress? Well, let me start with just a little anecdote from my very first day in China.
Okay.
Because mind you, I had never actually taken Chinese, Scott, when I arrived to China. So I had very little knowledge of the culture and even less knowledge of the language. But when I arrived, my liaison took me around to show me the town. It was like this especially hot and humid day, and we stopped to grab a Coke in what was basically the equivalent of like a bodega.
Okay.
And I insisted that I try to communicate with the shopkeeper since I, soon enough have to do this on my own.
Sure.
So, equipped with no language skills whatsoever, I tried to pantomime a drinking gesture and repeated over and over, Coke, Coke, Coke. And after some befuddlement, the shopkeeper indicated that she understood what I meant. She left the counter and she went behind a curtain. And when she came back, she had this small bowl of dried fish in her hand, and she put this on the countertop and rang me up. And it was like, in that moment, I realized I needed to learn Chinese. So I went back to my apartment. I took a short power nap, right? I woke up and I began my learning journey. And I took a notebook and I took a pocket dictionary, which I brought with me. And I headed out into this city, this unknown city. And I did the same thing every day for months. I'd hop onto a bus at random, just like a city bus, and I would ride it until I saw something out of the window that caught my attention. I would get off, and I just began to speak with people. And after a few, seconds of conversation, I'd hit a roadblock. There'd be something I'd want to communicate that I just didn't know how to.
Mm-hmm.
I'd make a note of this in my notebook, and I'd head home. And then that night, I'd use the dictionary to learn what it is I wanted to say. The next day, I'd venture back out, and each day I was able to speak a few additional sentences for a few additional seconds. And each day during these first few months, right, I actively sought failure, right? I intentionally brought myself to the edge of my knowledge, and then I leaped gleefully into that proverbial learning pit below, right? And that night, I pull myself out of it, only to jump right back into it the following day, right? In this instance, failure was fun. It was exhilarating, right? It brought me joy. Mistakes were not something that I feared, but rather they were something that illuminated all that I had left to learn. They were something that I actively pursued. So for me, failure was no longer a headwind. It became a tailwind propelling me forward, right? Mistakes humbled me, but in humbling me, I felt empowered. Now, when we think about education and we kind of apply this to teaching, this is not a simple thing for us to instill in our teachers, right? Mistakes are scary, truly.
Right.
The trouble is that when we fear failure, when we fear mistake making in school, the process of experimentation begins to feel like this really exhausting slog with all of our energy focused aren't, not tumbling off of a cliff, as opposed to just, on the learning that we gain through the process. But the thing is, right, like when you redo your kitchen, things look a lot messier before they look nicer, right?
Absolutely.
Like this is a part of the experimentation process. So what we need to do is clarify that fog of uncertainty that holds people back from experimentation. So when we think of teaching and learning these days, especially as school leaders, we should think of it as a heuristic device, right? Like an approach to problem solving, to learning, to discovery that's not guaranteed or even meant to be optimal, but is rather meant to be a journey towards figuring out what works best for our times, our context, our students, and ourselves, right?
Yeah.
With such a mindset, we can more easily create the conditions to encourage and celebrate risk-taking, knowing that the resultant mistakes can help to blaze a path for future successes. Of course, the value of mistakes in this context is predicated on those who make them being versed in how to actually learn from them. So like as school leaders, we may be the purveyors of change initiatives, but it's our faculty who are the practitioners. So we have to find ways to enable our faculty to learn from the mistakes that they're bound to make when they're trying something new. So how do we ignite these feelings? Well, one way is by cultivating a culture of trust and and support and psychological safety. And I think we'll kind of continue to talk about those three things throughout the
we
course
will.
of this conversation.
Yeah, so a lot to unpack off that opening one, but I mean, what I want to know first is what was that in the bowl that was put before you?
So it was just a bowl of like a dried and salted fish, like almost
To eat?
like a fish jerky. Yeah, like to eat. Exactly. Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
So whatever, I did take an acting class in college and I didn't do terribly well. And I guess my pantomime skills just, aren't up to par and certainly are not translatable across cultures.
Yeah.
So,
Well, that is interesting. Did you eat it?
yes,
And was it
yes.
good?
It was.
Oh,
Yeah. I
okay.
mean, I'm a pretty adventurous eater and having lived in several countries, I definitely pride myself on kind of whatever's put in front of me, I'll definitely nibble at.
Okay. Well, and so you opened up talking about failure, and that a lot of times we're afraid of failure because of what may come from it. And so if I can go back to yesterday's failure debacle, whatever we want to call it, misfire, is that as host. When I start having failures on my end, I think that part of what brings out that emotion and the feeling in me is that, am I going to lose this guest?
Mm.
And that's my one thing that I wish we could go back and count how many times I either typed or said I'm sorry,
Mm.
and because even though it was out of my control, I think it was the fear that I've got a great topic, I've got a great person, and they're going to think, oh, this is amateur hour. I don't have time for this. So I mean, does that align to what you're saying as far as why we try to avoid failure?
Yeah, I think, I think there's this sense, like in that moment, you're kind of expressing, this sort of kind of apprehension around, failure, these feelings of guilt and embarrassment. I don't think that that's something that is unique, to you. And I certainly don't think that it's something that's innate to, educators, right? I think there are many, educators in classrooms around the world who are conducting, action research in their classrooms and, leading the way and transforming and bettering teaching practices. But, like any profession, there are going to be educators who harbor feelings of trepidation and low-level anxiety around failure. But
Yeah.
the reasons for these are really varied and really diverse. And, obviously, no kind of, collection of professionals function as a monolith. And these feelings are really quite normal and quite universal. And they're actually seen, really interestingly across basically every profession. There's this really interesting study, Scott, from 2019, of British doctors.
Okay.
And they reported in the face of mistakes, these really powerful emotional reactions when they were asked to just visualize commit an error. So all they're asked to do, all the prompt is just, picture yourself in this, particular circumstance. And I want you to imagine yourself committing a mistake. And or excuse me, these doctors, kind of in responding to this prompt, they used words like they were scared, they felt guilty, they felt embarrassed, they felt fearful. They used phrases like extraordinarily awful, and frightening and discouraging, just to describe this visualization exercise, right? But not one doctor who participated in the study said it's an opportunity.
Oh.
And so when I look back to yesterday, you were certainly apologizing, but at no point did we really say to ourselves, this is really an exceptional opportunity for us to be able to troubleshoot all this technology on your end, for us to actually have this like shared and kind of collaborative lived experience through the exact topic that we're going to be talking about. And I think that often when we're able to just simply reframe something as an opportunity, it can actually really bolster us in the face of mistake making.
Yeah.
So there is this sense, for teachers, that there is this fear of failure, and it is very common. But I think that more than anything, because obviously we're talking, strictly kind of about education today, I think the trouble is that a reluctance to, experiment, to risk failure, to learn from mistakes on behalf of teachers, I think is uniquely and singularly problematic when compared to other professions. So harboring those feelings of trepidation are in no way unique. But I think that the actual manifestation and the kind of like byproduct of that fear is kind of unique. Right? Because here we are right in the midst of this fourth industrial revolution, but we're still kind of stuck in these patterns and habits that have remained kind of largely unchanged since the second industrial revolution.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And many educators and administrators are wrestling with this exact conundrum, right? How do we actually kind of, update education? And there's this growing and collective sense that we need to be, bold and daring when inspiring learners with this kind of change that will prepare students for the world of both today and tomorrow. And as administrators, we have to be sure that we're cultivating and nurturing the conditions for our faculty to help us to realize this emerging future for our students. And part of that's going to be normalizing failure, just by virtue of the way we respond to failure when it occurs. And, earlier we had spoken about this idea of perspective and patience, of humor. And I know that we'll unpack that a little bit more as well.
Yeah, we certainly will, and you've opened up the door to move into the next area. I want to address though the opportunity of yesterday's failure is that you're absolutely right. We never once said this is a great opportunity, but then that was one of the first things that we talked about today. And that when the audio engineer came in, we were diagnosing hardware problems. It was an opportunity for me to learn more about the equipment that I sit in front of every day. And but there was also an opportunity to realize that just because I believe that my laptop is, programmed to do certain functions, it doesn't always do that. Sometimes it chooses to do what it wants to do, which can throw things off. So you're absolutely about opportunity. And so whether we're leaders of the district, leaders of the building, leaders of the classroom, it is up to us to help normalize failure to those whom we lead. You present some strategies for this. We've given little nuggets of them. Now I think we're going to try to touch on them a little bit more. I think first you list the most important, though, is setting the tone. Can you share what this means and what this looks like in our schools?
Yeah, well, I think if we're talking about why do we want to normalize failure, right? And I think that kind of, alluding to the point I kind of just made, was if we want to normalize failure in order to help our students to realize this emerging future, then I think one of the things that we as kind of school leaders first have to recognize and appreciate is that we don't have the answers ourselves. It's going to take a village to be able to kind of, solve and resolve some of these larger questions that are currently facing education. So I think there are a handful of things that we can do, but I think first and foremost, it's going to be about a mindset shift on behalf of school leaders and administrators. And I think that begins with our kind of replacing hubris with humility. Recognition that we need to work in tandem with our teachers to begin to experiment, explore, and examine our existing practices in order to bring about change. That I certainly don't have any, panaceas or silver bullets available to me that I can simply, share to my teachers and that can be, applied across, discipline and grade level. And, suddenly all students are going to just be able to learn. And I think rather what we want to be able to do is equip our, faculty with the confidence that they need to be able to actually, figure out what works for their students. So I think the first thing in terms of setting the tone is again kind of removing our ego from the equation and really leading from a place of humility. And I think kind of like a logical kind of extension of that, if we think of that as kind of the axle, then there's kind of like several spokes around it.
Okay.
And I think one is really seeing mistakes as a springboard for future learning, as opposed to an endpoint. And I think we talked yesterday, Scott, a little bit about or you kind of mentioned yesterday we never really used that word opportunity, right? But today we did. And I think that when we're able to see the mistakes that we're making, even kind of in that present moment, as something that is actually going to propel us forward, it can be really exciting. And it can kind of in that moment kind of embody all the, the fun and frustration of learning, as opposed to all of the sort of self-admonishment and self-flagellation that sort of comes with looking back, and all of the, head wringing that comes with thinking about and trying to dwell on the mistakes that perhaps we've made. So I think that when we begin to see mistakes as a springboard for future learning and future inquiry and future efforts, as opposed to an endpoint, I think that that serves us really well too as administrators in terms of working with our faculty to be able to sit with someone and actually say, hey, you made this mistake. Let's not litigate or adjudicate that mistake itself. Instead, let us think about how this mistake is actually going to make you a better teacher moving forward, how it's actually going to help and benefit your students moving forward. And I think that that small shift can be extremely powerful. And I think kind of going hand in hand with that is we need to get curious rather than get certain. I think as school leaders and administrators, time is always tight. Time is just not a resource that we really have in any sort of great abundance.
Right.
And as a result, what we tend to do, I can certainly put my hand up here, is there are times when I'll kind of default to trying to rush to the answer because I assume I know exactly how we arrived at that place. And the fact is, I don't.
Yeah.
Mistakes, if they're treated correctly, can offer us this unparalleled glimpse into this really like the really opaque sort of machinations of learning that are taking place sort of invisibly behind the scenes, and because they can offer us that glimpse, because they can offer us that insight, we really want to get curious and we want to be able to ask a lot of questions and get really kind of inquisitive as to why it is that we're at this place in the first place and where can we go from there, because obviously that's going to largely sort of dictate and determine what those next steps can actually look like and how we can support that teacher in realizing them. And then I would also say, to just be able to do more of the listening, than the talking. We need to be able to trust our faculty as the professionals that they are. And there's a reason that the mistake was made. So rather than assume that we understand why that mistake was made, I think that we want to ask questions and we really want to listen to those answers. And we want to make sure that we are kind of bracketing our own biases and assumptions and the baggage that we bring to these conversations. And so the more questions that we ask, right, the more listening that we do, the more curious that we are, the more future oriented that we are, and the more humble that we are, the better able we're going to be able to set the tone for our faculty. Now, in addition to just setting the tone, because a lot of what I'm sharing is how you want to, respond to mistakes in a kind of one-on-one setting. For example, if you were in let's say evaluation conversation and you saw an error during, an observation that you conducted, this might be how you want to have kind of that quiet one-on-one conversation. That's how you kind of set the tone. But I think a lot of times convincing faculty that you actually want them to make mistakes, like that's a real sort of departure from many workplaces.
Yeah.
Right? So a lot of that, I think, is really kind of tightly wrapped up in this idea of how do we respond when they make a mistake, not just to them quietly in those one-on-one meetings, but how do we actually defend them publicly? So when a parent comes and says to you or sends you an email and says something like, hey, what happened in so-and-so's class today? How do we handle that with that parent? How do we then loop that teacher back in? How do we express and exhibit and really demonstrate to that teacher that we have their back and that we want our school to truly be this laboratory for experimentation, and that we are articulating that vision to our parents and our guardians and our students so that they are all on board with that vision as well. So I think in some ways it's really addressing things, setting the tone is really kind of about balancing the interplay that exists between the micro level and having those kind of intimate private conversations with the more macro level, which is really kind of setting the direction for the school at large and communicating that clearly to your parents and other stakeholders.
Sure. And you can see why setting the tone is first of the three strategies. It's so important in how then we proceed. And one thing that you said that I can appreciate is that we don't have to recognize failure for what it is in the moment. It's something that we can look back. If I'm understanding that right, which we kind of displayed with the opportunity. Didn't see opportunity yesterday, completely see opportunity today. And so as we get into next two strategies, which are equally as important, the first one I love, it's humor. Although It took me a long time yesterday to be able to laugh at my mistakes going on. The other is recognizing that as humans, we're going to make mistakes, which, again, to tie into yesterday, I shared with you and share with all listeners. My laptop was trying to run Zoom off a hotspot on my phone. There's no way it's got the bandwidth to do that. So humans, we're going to make mistakes. I never once thought it could be as simple as checking Wi-Fi. I know this is a big question, but what does each of these look like, and how can we use this understanding to help us learn and move on post-failure?
Well, I think I love that idea, right? I'm so glad that you circled back to that comment I made, because it's such an important one, right? Like, wrongness, Scott, is not something that we literally cannot experience wrongness in the moment. Right. Yeah. It's something that we experience afterwards. Right. And it's not something we can experience contemporaneous to the mistake itself, because if we did, we wouldn't make the mistake. Right. Yeah. So this knowledge and recognition of error is something that we always have to reflect upon. Right. There can be, by definition, no particular feeling associated with being wrong. Right. When it's happening, we are oblivious to it, right? Mistakes are invisible to us until they are not. And it's not until we realize that we're wrong that really the learning can begin. And I think largely that sets the stage for why humor can be, so important. But I think let me start with this idea of error climate. Have you ever heard of the idea of an error climate?
I have not.
Okay, so let me get into this a little bit. So as administrators, we set the conditions for the error climate that fosters the right kind of response to mistakes that will prompt the sort of reflection and rethinking for our faculty to reconcile their error and retrain their neural pathways to avoid the mistake in the future, right? What we want is in our schools is what's called a high error climate,
okay,
right? As opposed to a low error climate. And in a high error climate, people are motivated to correct their errors and pursue an understanding why they made a mistake. So a high error climate sets the stage for mistakes to be seen as an integral element to the learning process.
Yeah.
The thing is, right, as we've discussed, right, this aversion to mistakes is such like an automatic and socialized response that leveraging mistakes as an instrument of learning really can't be pathologized, right? It's not just as simple as that. So consideration needs to be given to offsetting those self-preserving brain patterns that actually hinder adaptive responses to mistake making in the first place. So counterintuitive though it may be, this is why humor is so important, right?
Okay.
One of the clear distinguishing features that the research has found between a low and high error climate is whether we respond to mistakes with acerbity or humor. So according to the research, humor is like this dispositional hinge point that can diffuse, that self-admonishment that may naturally arise following a mistake. So a professional playfulness can actually like relax tensions and create a more forgiving atmosphere. Moreover, responding to a mistake with, a chuckle or like a genial grin can actually elucidate the erroneous schematic that contributed to the mistake being made in the first place. So if handled properly, humorous moments can offer insight into thinking and serve as springboards for further inquiry. So a bit of levity is this really versatile tool to actually foster a culture of mistake learning. And perhaps this is because mistake making and humor share this really parallel structure, right?
Yeah.
There's this theory called incongruity theory, and it posits that both comedy and errors arise from a mismatch, right? So specifically a mismatch between expectation and actuality. So these situations begin with an attachment to a belief. That belief is then violated. It produces surprise, confusion, and replacement beliefs. And ultimately, school leaders set the tone. So when we approach mistake making with this sense of humor rather than, let's say, exasperation, it can translate into our teachers doing the same and giving themselves a little bit more professional grace and actually helping them to move on from the mistake and move into the learning from that mistake. Now, as for recognizing the humanity of making a mistake,
right,
across 5 studies, the results suggest that people will learn more if failure can be separated from ego, right? So following a mistake, we have to remind our faculty that making mistakes is not atypical. And we also want to do exactly, Scott, what your administrator has done, right? Which is remove yourself from the mistake, right? Depersonalizing the mistake by shifting that language to extract yourself from the mistake that you maybe have made. And
Yeah.
this is something that we see being done with great success actually in other industries. And it's actually widely cited. I really like this as a reason that the aviation industry has become the safest transportation industry. It was in 1976 that NASA set up the Aviation Safety Reporting System, otherwise known as ASRS.
Okay.
And the ASRS reporting system was revolutionary, right? It became the first government initiated reporting system that guaranteed confidential, voluntary, non punitive reporting on workplace mistakes.
Oh.
Now, up until the 1970s, the widespread assumption had been that cockpit error played a secondary role to technical malfunction in plane crashes. But upon the introduction and standardization of black boxes, right, as we now know them on
Right.
flights, accident analyses, right, showed that technical issues actually played a secondary role. Now, initial efforts to call crews' attentions to this data obviously backfired, right? Pilots grew really defensive and outright dismissed the findings. So NASA was stuck with belligerent pilots and a mountain of data telling them that user error was primarily responsible for this, glut of plane crashes. And so this is where the idea of ASRS was born. So since this anonymized, confidential, non-disciplinary system was implemented, there have been hundreds of thousands of reports filed with a correlated reduction in pilot error of 71%.
Wow.
Literally hundreds of flights have been saved as a result of this reporting system, right? So like pilots, our teachers need us to help them to depersonalize mistakes and focus less on the self-admonishment and more on the self-growth.
And so I love hearing the statistic, being that I travel frequently between Maryland and Illinois. But you're absolutely right in the schoolhouse that being able to remove, like you said, what my administrator did. There was never an admonishment. It was never like how did I ever hire you as a teacher if that's how you're teaching? It was more of the deconstruction of, did I see what she saw, and did I have the ability to go in? And you can see just how creating that environment and everything can be so powerful. The humor piece, it likens me to times we say, well, that went so wrong. All you could do was laugh. I've said that before. And so I'm thinking that's where the humor comes in. Am I getting it right?
Yeah, one of the most, I think that's exactly right. I think as school leaders, we are setting the tone, obviously, in the buildings, and we're going to ask people around us to make mistakes, which also means that we have to be very willing to publicly admit our own shortcomings as well, and our own failings.
Mm-hmm.
It was in my last school, actually, where my now mentor, stood up in front of the school, this particular case, a middle school. And he said, look, I tried to create this schedule. We created a schedule, in an office behind closed doors. And when we rolled it out, we basically didn't realize that there was going to be this particular conflict. But if I want to create an environment where you are going to be able to be risk takers, where you are going to be able to seek and blunder and make mistakes and be forgiven and learn and reconcile and grow, I have to be able to do that as well. So I am telling you that we are going to be changing our schedule. Here is our new schedule. So as opposed to, hiding behind advisors to distribute the schedule or anything like that, he called for a full division meeting so that he could be up there and actually lead by example. I think one of my favorite phrases, right, is that students can't be what they can't see. And I would say the same thing for our faculty, right? They cannot be what they cannot see. And it is of the utmost importance that when we're seeking to set that tone, we're able to get up there and, in my particular case, because I tend to default to humor, I'll put in my hand and go, wow, that was pretty boneheaded, wasn't it? And then I go from there.
Yeah.
And it really does have this incredible sort of unparalleled way to diffuse tension and to actually garner a lot of goodwill, right? And for people to thus kind of be more forgiving with you, and for you guys to all be able to kind of move on collectively.
Yeah, and it sets up, before we go, we're going to address mistake literacy. Cannot let the conversation get away without it. Now, I'm sure listeners today, They're familiar with various literacies. We've got financial literacy. We've got digital literacy. So it only makes sense. We also have mistake literacy. Let's close out today's episode recognizing that mistakes are natural and unavoidable. So what can we do to truly capture the learning behind making mistakes?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Let me just start by, I guess, kind of laying a foundation, sort of a bit of a definition for kind of what mistake literacy is.
Yes,
So
please.
mistake literacy, yeah, it's a mindset consistent of this suite of dispositions and non-cognitive skills that work in tandem to optimize learning by building individuals' capacity and capability to recognize, react to, and repair their mistakes. So mistake literacy is about growing one's understanding of mistake making, creating the conditions for individuals to meaningfully engage with their mistakes, and equipping individuals with the competencies to learn from their mistakes. So in short, mistake literacy aims to pave the way for future learning to occur by counteracting our tendency to ignore, deny, downplay, and just outright disavow our mistakes. So becoming mistake literate kind of involves a complex web of invisible relationships that includes cultural factors, workplace conditions, and self-efficacy. And there's no simple starting point to initiate this shift at school or amongst a faculty, because every person has different experiences and motivations that they're bringing with them. However, there's one piece of information that, in my experience, presenting to groups about mistake literacy seems to resonate most. It's perhaps even triggers some measure of clarity, and this is that our bodies actually want us to learn from our mistakes.
Okay.
Like we are biologically predisposed to learning from mistakes, which actually, evolutionary, makes a lot of sense, doesn't it?
Right.
So the phenomenon of post-error slowing, or PES, refers to the tendency of participants to slow down on a current trial after having committed an error on a previous trial. So this is a biological response to mistake making, and not one that a participant is actually conscious of. So in other words, when engaging in an activity that we've done erroneously before, our bodies acknowledge this and delay successive action, giving us this sort of gap in time, this delay, for us to actually begin to learn and do things differently the second time around. Moreover, there was this 2018 study out of Caltech that discovered that mistakes set off an almost instantaneous chain reaction of productive brain activity. So these researchers found that before one is even cognizant of their error, one set of neurons that they dubbed error neurons begin to fire. And then in rapid fire succession, the brain of a person making an error lights up with the kind of activity that encodes information more deeply. So our bodies not only slow us down, giving us an opportunity to do things differently a second time, but in addition to that, they actually encode that information more deeply. So in other words, when we learn from an error, that learning is going to sustain itself over a longer period of time than it would if we just learned it outright in the first place. So learning by error is actually more virtuous than not. Isn't that pretty fascinating?
Well, not only is that fascinating, but in tying it in to what has been the underlying theme of trying to make this episode, come about, is that taking yesterday, you said that there will be, like a conscious effort to avoid the mistake again. I mean, I shared with you when we first connected this morning, I was here 30 minutes ahead of time running all different kinds of tests on my equipment, on the studio equipment, to make sure that we wouldn't have the same experience, all because of what I learned yesterday.
I love what you brought up. Now, Scott, I happen to be, I'm a baseball guy. I love baseball.
Yeah.
I'm a big Yankee fan. And you're actually in Maryland. So let me use the example of if you remember the slugger Chris Davis, who played for the Baltimore Orioles.
Yes.
Right. So let's think about Chris Davis. Right. Chris Davis would strike out 200 times in a season. Right. Like everything I just said was Chris Davis as a human is biologically predisposed to learning from his mistakes. Right.
Right.
But when he would strike out 200 times in a season, he wasn't destined to lead the league in home runs the following season, right?
Right.
He had 200 opportunities to learn from his mistakes, for his body to slow down and allow him the space to examine and self-evaluate. And yet he never learned how to lay off, right, that 2-2 slider, right? And right, in spite of our biology, it's not just a given that we're going to respond the way that, you did here, Scott, right?
Yeah.
We are socialized, really socialized, to avoid mistakes So we have to work really hard, especially as school leaders, to offset this response in our faculty. And there really is no simple solution. Again, because it's so sort of acculturated, but if a school leader can lead with humility and perspective and humor and patience and all of these things that we actually spoke about at kind of the top of the podcast, we can begin to bring this culture of mistake learning to life in our schools.
And it's definitely something that we need to bring about in our culture and to foster the mistake literacy and everything else. Definitely, this is a conversation we should have had a long time ago on Anchored in Education. And Zak, I thank you so much for joining us and just, helping us realize that normalizing failure is where we need to be.
Thanks so much, Scott. I really appreciate the time today.
Now, you can find Zak on Twitter, search at Cohen_Zak with a K, or on his website, zakcoheneducation.com. Before I wrap up today's episode, don't forget to head over to my website, escottengland.com, and click on today's episode link to read more about Zak. And don't forget to subscribe to Anchored in Education on whatever platform you get your podcasts. See? We made it through the entire episode without issue. I can't say that I wasn't sitting on pins and needles just waiting for something to go wrong, but that is also part of correcting mistakes. We are at first a little hypersensitive to trying again. I get it. But let's reframe it from hypersensitive to hyperattentive. A small change, a huge difference. Think back to my first grade disaster lesson. Like we discussed last week with Meredith, a course correction was needed. That particular failure allowed me to become more attentive to the needs of first graders. Did that mean I never made a mistake again, or that I never had to correct courses midway through? Not at all. But learning from my previous mistake allowed me to become more attentive to my own misconceptions on child development. No matter what it is or what we're doing, we will all make mistakes. Society tries to impress upon us that we cannot mess up. That is absurd. We are human. We will mess up. If we reframe it correctly, we stand to learn and grow, which is exactly what we need to remain anchored in education.